Livery Company. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar. Today's been hosted by the Freeman Group, which I am part of, and it is part of the Livery that is trying very hard to grow and expand its membership as part of the Chartered Surveyors Livery Company, which effectively has three foundations, mainly education, charity and fellowship. We'd love anybody who's out there who would like to become a Freeman of our group to get in touch with me or the Chartered Surveyors Company has a website there which we can let you have the link in due course. Today we are joined by Alastair Moss, Chairman of the City Corporation Planning and Transportation Committee. I'm delighted that Alastair can be with us today, and thank you very much for your time. Alastair is also, in his spare time, co-head of the real estate team at Memory Crystal, a leading law firm based here in Fleet Street. And he's also had the fortunate position to be chairman of planning at Westminster City Council. So he's really seen the planning side from both sides of the central part of London. He's also been an army reservist for the last 25 years, which some say has actually adequately skilled him for dealing with a different type of war that we're dealing with at the moment. COVID-19 has affected all of us in one way, shape or another. But I'm delighted that he has taken time out of his busy diary to talk to us. Of the many things that we're going to cover over the next 40 minutes, there will be time for questions. Will be the city's approach to COVID-19. Everyone has had to react, and I'm sure you're all intrigued as to what just has the City Corporation been up to, and Alastair's going to talk us through that. There's an all-important City Plan 2036, which is planning and getting us ready for the future. A plan which was hatched pre-COVID, and I know Alastair will touch on his team who are looking very much at some of the outputs of COVID-19 and how that plan might well be modified before it becomes adopted in 2022. And I know that the city would welcome everybody's input into the consultation stage that will come through. City is also involved in a significant number of capital projects. As you would expect, we have the City of London Law Courts and the new City Police Station coming to Fleet Street. We've got the Museum of London, the new City Concert Hall, the Smithfield potential relocation and regeneration of West Smithfield, to name but few, and Alastair has kindly agreed to just touch on those as well. In recent years, the city has also embraced the business improvement district environment, something which I personally have been involved in for over 20 years, from a visit under the LIPS program, the Local Improvement Partnership Schemes program, to New York back in the late 1990s. The country has adopted it. We now have 50 in London, 300 across the country, and the city is embracing it by encouraging areas to set up partnerships with a view to becoming business improvement districts within the square mile. And then finally, just by way of a touch point really in terms of the Chartered Surveyors Livery Company, I know we'd all be interested in knowing just how important the livery companies are to the future of the city and going forward. There will be time for questions, so in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, please do post some questions which we will come to, and I hope you have an enjoyable afternoon. Alastair, thank you very much again for joining us, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Alastair. I almost had the "you're on mute" moment there of unmuting myself. So yeah, thanks for that very kind introduction. I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm going to do a fair amount of talking now, but I want to leave an adequate time for your questions after this, please, because that's really what I'm here for, to hear from you predominantly, but hopefully what I can impart to you. Some of you may already know, but some of it may be news. the overall message I want to get across is that we're really here in partnership with you, with all the diverse interests that you represent, and that this is really a collective endeavour as far as I'm concerned. You know, the positive thing about the pandemic is that, as far as I'm aware, it's probably the only time in human endeavour that we've had one single purpose across humankind, which is, in theory, of something that we can coalesce and all work towards together. And I think it's in the spirit of that I hope you're seeing that local authorities like the Corporation of London have hopefully turned a page in terms of how we operate and how we interact with people. Going to the army analogy that, or reference that Alastair raised there, I have a good friend of mine who does coaching, Jonathan Bowman Perks. He's ex-army, far more distinguished career than I've ever had. And he said right at the start of the pandemic, you know, this is going to be like a war. You know, we will have a long period of time that we'll have to deal with this. It's not going to be a few weeks. And how right he's been. And I think, as you also said, Alastair, everyone is affected by this. There is no one that's been untouched by the pandemic. So, you know, it's an opportunity for us to all kind of support each other, I suppose. And the corporation has been very, very busy, really, since March, dealing with that. But first, to touch on the liveries. As you said, Alastair, the livery movement is an extremely important one. And I always think with the city, you know, that whether we're actually physically present in the city or distant from it, coming in a few days a week, you know, that there are thousands of supporters of the city in its broadest sense, who we often wear different hats. And one of those areas in which we interact is through the livery companies. And the liveries have for centuries changed purpose, you know, in terms of what they do, but certainly your company has such extreme relevance to what we do today, but also provides a forum for things like this, but also as a fraternal society is there to achieve the endeavours of what the city in its widest sense stands for. And I think quite often the city gets a bad press in terms of how it is perceived, but I know and you know that really a lot of goodwill and a lot of common purpose. So thank you for your involvement with that, and say to reinforce our corporation's recognition of that. And say events like this afternoon are a really important forum for us to get message across. So I just want to touch on three areas. The first is our response to the pandemic. The second is our recent developments in the city. And the third is our vision for the future. And say have Q&A afterwards where you can ask what you like. Most of you will be aware of the fact that we're pretty ancient in our 800-year history. And, you know, we do also, as well as providing all the development and things that you'll be more familiar with, do provide things like social care and public, so deal with public health. And, you know, we've got 11,000 acres of open spaces. We've got a whole load of schools, both independent and academic schools. And we have, I think it's around 6 or so housing estates of our own. So, you know, we're doing that as well as promoting the UK's financial and professional services around the world through the Square Mile and beyond. And my role is really, I suppose, as the political lead for the city's built environment in its broadest sense. I chair a committee of 35 people made up of aldermen and common councilmen. You know, we make decisions with subcommittees and others that are about, you know, making the city clean, safe, well-planned buildings and a good transport system. And of course, that involves interaction with TfL, with national government and things. And importantly, with the stakeholders of the city, residents, visitors, workers, and also developers. And as you're also, I'm sure, all aware, our electoral franchise is unique in that, as well as a residential vote, we also have a business vote as well, which I think, and I'm biased on this, makes us very accountable because we're generally not party political. We are accountable to our electorate, who are a cross-section of workers and residents across the square mile. And that is I think well, it's unique and a really good thing. I feel very, very accountable to my electorate in the ward of Cheap, I can tell you. So our response to COVID-19, as I said, this has brought significant changes to all of our lives, some good, some bad. And the reality is, for financial and professional services, most of the city has shown itself to be very resilient and to be quickly adapting and thriving. I mean, in my law firm, for example, we were working remotely a week before lockdown, and there was a continuation of service. So, they've shown great resilience. Now, of course, that does call into question, I'll come on to this, the use of space and how we interact and things, but that's the kind of headline figure. And the sector has had a role in developing solutions in terms of like how we've dealt with this over this period. And there are obviously some businesses which are far more reliant upon footfall and interaction than there are others. There are also others, I think it's fair to say, who there are more concerned from a regulatory perspective as to how they can operate remotely, as opposed to working in the kind of normal office environment. And of course, our focus has been on supporting people in the city, employees, businesses in the financial system. It's about sustaining that work in terms of our long-term competitiveness and securing long-term needs on things like climate action and other things, and also speeding that recovery so when we are ready to relaunch into a full and stronger economy, we're really set up to do that. And one thing, a theme which is pervading now, I'd say, in terms of policy from the City Corporation, is that we are very sure about where we're going. We're very confident about the future. We have plans, as you'll hear, as to where we're going, which we want to hear from you on and have heard from you on. And we view the COVID-19 pandemic, yes, as a bit of a gear change, but realistically, the same challenges and opportunities are still out there. We are hotly pursuing them. In terms of our support for businesses, because we do recognise, of course, we do need to keep the show on the road, and some businesses need more support for others. We are obviously a major landowner. We own around a quarter of the city. I had the privilege a few years ago of chairing the city's property fund. So we've done the things that responsible landlords would have done by changing rental payments to monthly, deferring rent for those who are struggling, writing off interest, for example. Our charitable arm, the City Bridge Trust, we've given 170 small charities in London £15,000 each to support them through COVID-19. That is a charity, by the way, that gives around £20 million a year to London charities across London. And that trust also gave £5 million to the coronavirus emergency fund called London Community Response to help charitable community and social organisations across the capital, up to 6 million. So that's how we've been supporting businesses throughout, as well as all the usual kind of advice on rates, transportation issues and others, which I'll touch on. In terms of where my involvement is in terms of transportation, we've implemented a whole range of measures to ensure that people can confidently return to the city. We've seen levels around 20% or so. I hope most of you have been into the city if you can and feel confident to do so. And I've been clear that we can't be the weak link in terms of how people will interact with the city and come back. So there are obviously really three stages to this. There's the transportation side to the city. There's the city itself in terms of walking and cycling predominantly. And then there is the COVID secure offices and premises that comprise our food and beverage offer, etc. Transport recovery plan where, in a nutshell, we've prioritised space for pedestrians and cycling, and where people are allowed to socially distance and can socially distance. And we've reallocated space to walking and cycling with pedestrian priority streets, limited access to motor vehicles, and we've closed some streets, like Cheapside, for example, to through traffic, except in some cases for buses and people cycling. So, you know, that has been a shift, but going to what I was saying a few minutes ago, we have plans to do that in terms of pedestrian priority streets were on the stock, so to speak, before the beginning of this calendar year. So we've accelerated our transport strategy plan as a result of the pandemic, as part of this Bring Back Better, and also about, say, making people feel secure. We're working with Southwark and Camden, running a COVID-compliant accreditation scheme, which is, I think, I'm told the first that's been launched by local government. And we're also now, as you've probably seen around with environmental health, certifying places to be COVID compliant. And I should say here, I think it should be recognised by national policymakers, the huge investment that is being made in public and private money in making food and leisure and gym and other uses COVID secure. A huge amount of money spent in offices, equally money spent on highways in terms of our measures, and you would have seen those across London, and those for those of you outside of London as well, particularly around schools and transport hubs and things, and indeed on the national rail and regional transport network. Again, a large amount of money has been spent there in terms of the investment secure. And this week, hot off the press, we published London Recharged, which is a report which looks at the future of London, providing recommendations on actions that we can take now to ensure long-term competitiveness for London and support the recovery across the UK. Again, it's important, as I was saying before, that we are saying we're exuding confidence because we know we've got a great product here in London and we've got a great future. And that report is basically finding that businesses remain committed to central London. And we also need, though, to be investing in skills, digital infrastructure and built environment to remain competitive and as the global centre of choice. And I think it also is relevant to a lot of the people on this call now, explores how office stock and the built environment can be transformed in response to the trends such as increased remote and flexible working, which inevitably will be the case. Now, messaging is important, and I always believe we should back it up with substance. The future of the city remains bright. And from a planning perspective, which is the other side of my portfolio from transportation, we've seen an unprecedented level of pre-application discussions over major schemes. It would be fair to say I could probably fill my entire diary with people wishing to discuss pre-applications and our approach to them, which is really good and goes to show confidence. And I have to say that is from investment community across the world. It is not specifically domestic, and it's not specifically only international. Just by way of numbers, we've seen there are 6 new towers proposed and major area-wide transformative schemes, and some of you will be involved or will be even initiating those. And there is renewed optimism about the resurgence of the city. And just to kind of call out some of those, I've got here, I noted down 1 Finsbury Avenue and 80 Fenchurch Street, providing new flexible office space suited for co-working. I was privileged to visit 80 Fen the other day. What an amazing space with confident investors, confident occupiers looking to the future there. We will all know about 22 Bishopsgate, which is nearing completion, with a free-to-visit public viewing gallery with amazing views across London, and with flexible workspaces with health and well-being at its very core, being a real community in that tower. Development at 100 Liverpool Street, nearing completion. That being an exemplar of reuse of a 1980s building where we are, and I'll come to in a minute, our strategy is increasingly about the reuse of buildings where that's possible, about the whole carbon life cycle of buildings in this circular economy, and a presumption really against redevelopment, but for reuse, and indeed where there is redevelopment, for that being sustainable redevelopment, which will last not for decades, but for hopefully far more. There's a new dynamically designed tower at 6 to 8 Bishopsgate, which you'll probably be aware of, which again has a free public viewing pod, which is cantilevered at the top of that tower. And we've also granted permission for Citycape House, Newgate Street, for an office and hotel scheme faced with a living wall, which will be the largest in Europe, with all the major environmental and sustainability credentials that will bring to it. We do try to publicise these things, and the applicants try to publicise wherever there are good news stories, but as I say, it's genuinely my belief that these things speak for themselves. And also an increasingly common theme is that developers who see me say that they will be, on consent, starting development immediately. I was chairman of planning of Westminster Council, as Alastair alluded to a few years ago, and I was through the global recession 08 onwards, and it's true there a lot of sites stopped. That has not happened this time, and people remain very, very positive. Capital projects, the City Corporation said is a major landowner, and also we sponsor traditionally as part of our convention to sponsor major development. And I think these will redefine bits of the city. Salisbury Square development, which will, just off Fleet Street, which will develop a new civic hub with a state-of-the-art combined court and new headquarters for the City of London Police in the heart of the Square Miles Legal and Financial Services Quarter, which is very exciting. That planning application is due by the end of the year and should be delivered, subject to consents, of course, will be by 2026. And I very much hope, say, if consented, that will reputation to be a place to do business, working on our world-class repute with our justice system and legal system here, which is rivaled by none, and will also help the transformation of the Fleet Street area. We're hoping to create a new home for Billingsgate, New Spitalfield, and Smithfield markets at Dagenham Dock. Doesn't sound particularly glamorous, but these wholesale markets, of course, provide a really vital function to London, and we have a statutory duty to. So that will be exciting. We will be relocating the Museum of London to West Smithfield. Planning permission for that was granted by my committee back in June, and the plans for that are just amazing. That will be such a draw for both Londoners, people in the UK, and overseas visitors, and will be part of changing the nature of the city and how the city is perceived. There's also the current museum site next door to Bastion House, which provides an opportunity to perhaps provide a new centre for music, a concert hall, which will be world class, and we're looking at master planning that site as well. So there's a lot of work going on there in terms of the capital projects the City Corporation is the primary sponsor for. Moving on to business improvement districts, I think it's fair to say a few years ago, business improvement districts were not popular with the City Corporation. They didn't really exist, but I've had the privilege of sitting on the Cheapside Business Alliance now for years, where really there's a great coalescence of business and other stakeholders with the local authority there. That was successful in its ballot for a second term earlier this year. And also we have Aldgate Connect, Now, as Alastair knows and others on the call will also know, we are establishing two further partnerships, the Fleet Street Quarter and EC partnership, which is the Eastern Cluster. Alastair has been really key. Well, I think, Alastair, I say this publicly, it was really your idea, the Fleet Street Quarter partnership. Fleet Street itself is a ceremonial route, but is at the moment, bluntly, rather forlorn as part of the city. It's disjointed from the rest of the city, I perceive. And also, importantly, there are major development sites, of course, coming up, particularly on Fleet Street, and major occupiers moving and the opportunities all that provides, along with our new courts and police buildings. So a major role of that quarter will be, and that partnership will be to help shape and sculpt that. And say, Alastair, on behalf of the corporation, we're extremely grateful for all of there, and really say for initiating this. And by the end, in a few years' time, partnerships will cover about 2/3 of the city. So the majority of your businesses in the city will be covered by these bid footprints. And we're identifying, the bids have been extremely supportive, and partnerships have been very supportive during the COVID pandemic, particularly in hospitality and leisure sectors. And they are complementing the work of the city corporation in terms of licensing and planning and other things that are going on. And also in terms of, I was talking earlier about how the livery companies have worked, they have provided a forum for people to input into what the city does in terms of its wider scope for society and the economy. And the bids are doing all kinds of things like corporate gift cards here, loyalty cards, all the alfresco dining has been, they've been really part of. Social media platforms, which, as we know, our social media presence is as important, arguably, as our physical presence. Marketing collateral websites, and key economic research and charitable work as well. So that's really good work, and say hopefully some of you are already involved in those areas anyway. Moving on to the City Plan 2036, which Alastair talked about. We're seeking to future-proof the city through this for the next generation of our workers and residents and visitors. The aspirations of it in it are, in a nutshell, high-quality architecture, public realm, sustainable transport environment, and world-class to visitors, residents, and workers. And we're ambitious in it for the next 20 years, and we think it's flexible enough for us to meet medium and long-term challenges posed by COVID-19. And some of those features are more flexible office space to meet changing demand, urban greening, prioritising the needs of pedestrians in line with the transport strategy, freight consolidation, where we think the city should be run like a factory and that nothing should come in and out, ideally by way of goods, which isn't controlled and smartly delivered, mainly, of course, to reduce air pollution and traffic, and also to complement office space in terms of commercial and cultural retail growth. And following the recent changes of the use classes order, we need to build in climate action targets. Statutory consultation on that will be around January and March 2021. And then we should be with Secretary of State around June for that. So I'll be happy to take questions on that going forward. And to see where that all goes to. I'm doing too much talking here. I'm needing to drink. But transport strategy is a piece of work we're very, very proud of, and the city plan is aligned with that in terms of our other key strategies, such as the climate action strategy, which I'll come on to, and our transport strategy. That's a 25-year plan there. I've already talked about the prioritising of people walking, making the streets safer, etc. Having efficient and effective use of street space, and making cycling easier, improving air quality, and also reducing noise and improving transport, and getting to a vision zero really in the city where we eliminate road casualties on the streets, which should, I think, be an imperative for any local authority. Also, we've been working, and I alluded to this earlier, with TfL and the national government on making sure that there's confidence in public transport and encouraging responsible use of those modes of transport so that people can come into the city where it's important that they do so, where it's necessary for them to do so in the office environment. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that we recognise that TfL is under extreme pressure at the moment as a transport authority, and we're doing what we can to support them. But equally, there are some great things in the pipeline, like the Elizabeth line opening, which will simply transform areas like Farringdon, Smithfield, where we will be privileged on the city boundaries with Smithfield to basically be what I'm calling the new centre of London, with its transport nodes to virtually all the major airports and around, I think it's 200 train movements an hour from that station. So that will become a real hub for London, which we're privileged to have on our doorstep. Final point is on the climate action strategy. A lot of local authorities declared a climate emergency. We kind of stepped back and kind of thought, really, we want to do something where we research first and then come up with tangible solutions and a plan. It's not to criticise others who have spoken first and then worked out, but we felt we should do it the other way around. And we are investing, the corporation, £68 million over the years to tackling climate change. That will see, by way of example, the creation of 800 green jobs. We will be changing our city planning regulations to ensure carbon reduction designs and more sustainable designs, like, for example, the green roofs and walls that I talked about, to dedicating even more space to walking, cycling, new parks, time closures, and also future-proofing the city from things like flood and heat. You may be aware of the fact that we are now, we now have policies which are quite advanced on wind mitigation, but also we can map and we know where areas of the city are too hot, too cold, where the wind, etc., is an issue. So we're very attuned and becoming far more advanced about the experience of the city, so to speak. Part of this strategy is that we've committed to achieving net zero emissions in our own operations by 2027, which is very ambitious, and across all our investments and supply chain by 2040, and also for the city as a whole to be net zero carbon emissions by 2040. And we feel very strongly that this is a major draw for the city and one we can't afford not to be pursuing. I've now spoken for probably about half an hour, so I think, Alastair. So, I mean, in conclusion, I hope you can see that we are on the case in terms of dealing with the pandemic, but also we are forward-looking and on track. We're very conscious of our responsibilities. Equally, we are, and I've made this clear in virtually everything I've said, we don't think we have necessarily all the answers. We're open to experiment. A lot of the things I've talked about here, particularly on transportation, are experimental or temporary things. We're engaging more and more with people to really see how we navigate through this, but then as to what the future will look like. And also in terms of our engagement with you and those you interact with and other stakeholders, the door is very, very much open to these conversations because, say, this is a collaborative attitude, collaborative response. We think, though, that overall the city has got a lot going for it. London's got a lot going for it, and we're confident of that future. We just need to make sure we secure that. And with that, I'm happy to take Any questions, Alastair?
I was sitting here ticking off all the things that I was hoping you were going to cover. As I said in my preamble, I personally want to thank you on behalf of everybody on the call for being so open and being so informative about all of the things that mean so much to us in our city. I think it makes a huge difference to people's perception of the city, to actually learn that the city is very much open for business, and your diary is open for some collaborative conversations. I think the word symbiotic has been used a number of times in terms of us at a stage now where we all have to help each other get through this time. I've got a few questions that have come into the Q&A, one or two that were given to me beforehand. I'll try not to derail you in any particular way. One of the questions in the Q&A was surrounding the net zero promises that you just mentioned there, 2027 through to 2040.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate a little bit on how's it going to work by potentially closing bits of the city down? There's obviously some high density traffic between the embankment through to Tower Hill along Lower Thames Street, reducing the speed limits down to 20 miles an hour. How does the city see this working from a servicing point of view?
Yeah, so yeah, I know this is from Richard Snowden, isn't it? So it is a fair point. I'd say, first of all, that we recognise that at the moment we recognise the irony, if I could put it this way, that the city is at most 20% full, and yet there are some areas now where traffic is queuing. So that is just to get that out there. And we will therefore be looking at how we can amend parts of what we've done temporarily to be easing those areas, because as quite right, it doesn't make sense at the moment. However, mentioning freight consolidation and other things, that factory idea, we are building on some really, really exciting concepts as to how freight can be coordinated and delivered and stored and stuff, working with the market, but also doing our own things as well. It is my belief that we are close to having far more intelligent use of our road space in terms of deliveries both to and from the city, which is the majority of the traffic. There's so few private cars now kind of going through. It is to a degree construction traffic, but most of it is that delivery traffic. So I think that, I'm confident that it will become far less of an issue. But at the moment, say on the speed limit, by the way, part of our transport strategy is, by the way, to get a 15 mile an hour, 15 mile an hour speed limit into the city, mainly because we actually want all of our road surfaces to be spaces where people feel safe. The city isn't somewhere to come in where you think you can drive in a certain manner, so it's all about kind of tone there. But in a nutshell, say we're aware of congestion. We will be dealing with that, but we're not going to deviate from our overall plans to make the city streets safer and easier to access for all.
Great, thank you. One from Tim Bacon, always a hot potato in terms of residential in the city.
Yes.
I've had a chance to look at the plan 2036, and actually the City Corporation are not hiding from the issue of residential in the city. It's very open in terms of the messaging. I think Tim's point is, with potentially reduced demand for space and vacancy rates moving, will a future policy allow for a change of approach towards more residential in the square mile?
Well, residential there are important residential areas within the square mile first, which we protect and enhance. Second, we take our our duty to provide housing in terms of housing targets, and also to maintain our estates and provide housing outside of the city very seriously. The third angle, though, in terms of whether less use of office space will open up residential kind of turning towers. Well, look at what the market's doing. I mean, there is not, and what it's done over, I mean, there are people on this, there are people on this call who will have gone through various cycles, and what happens with the city is that space is just filled by other people. I mean, that's kind of, if we get this right, that's what will happen. It will be occupied in certain different ways, but equally we just have more people going in it. We know that there is demand for space. So, answering that directly, the city is not about to turn into a housing estate, and don't come to us with with proposals to convert to residential, because our policy going forward over the next few decades is going to be putting the commercial city first, and preserving the residential areas that we have. We've got the research which is done and constantly monitoring how office occupancies may change, but we can work on the basis that this is not going to be with us forever. We can also work on the basis that, if we're honest, the most efficient way that we work is probably a combination of office and work elsewhere. And I think in terms of our working patterns, we've all fortunately become experts on where we are best for certain outputs, which is great for efficiency, as I say. And the office still plays a major part in that. So that's not just me saying from a defensive corporation perspective, that is just objectively the evidence as well.
I think one of the interesting reports that I read this week was 50% of new occupiers, or 50% of the city, will be made up of new occupiers within the next 5 years, I think by 2025. And that's a real remarkable change, because actually that presupposes inward investment. It presupposes some changes that are going to attract non-city types, which has been a free flow in the marketplace over the last 10 years anyway, with some of the Westminster occupiers, traditional occupiers, those from what we call DAMIT, design, advertising, media, information technology, the social media types. It shows that the demand will be there and the welcome will be there for new types of occupiers, innovative occupiers. My question would be, so on top of what the city has already done, what do you think it will do to encourage new occupiers into the square mile?
I think a lot of that is in a sense making the city more interesting and increasing particularly its cultural offer and what it stands for. It is about a conscious move away from facelessness to one of a deep, kind of social and cultural offer. Because the majority of people working in the city are in the 20s and 30s, the majority of occupiers are SMEs, the majority of businesses are creative or have some creative element to them. So that is how I think the city will attract those kind of occupiers going forward, and that diversity. At the end of the day, we've got to have the City of London being a place that people across the world, talent across the world, would like to live and work in. And that's why we are obsessed about air quality, safety, our environment, what buildings look like, what the cultural offer is, housing, etc.
A question come in from Philip Benison. Just, the city is not especially well served with hotel offerings, and developing new hotel stock is difficult with the city's policy of not wanting to lose existing office stock. Are there any perhaps COVID-inspired initiatives to relax this policy, to boost hotel stock and endure a more vibrant 24/7 city environment?
Well, I can tell you that I've had various pre-app discussions with people wishing to create new hotels, and in the right areas, particularly around our culture mile, which is basically around the Barbican, Smithfield, etc. We're up for that. I know because I hear from constituents and others that in terms of the facilities that are there, people want to dwell in the city, and why wouldn't we have that there? There's all kinds of ideas that are coming to the fore in terms of the kind of spaces that we could have for interaction, for conference and stuff like that. Yes, there's no reason. My kind of very simplistic view on this is uses which are, I mean, this is where hotel use and others need to be differentiated from residential. Permanent residential does mean that the canvas that we have to respond, like now, is limited, more limited. Having hotel, having other types of temporary accommodation and office and other retail uses, and by the way, I think all the government's planning reforms on that are the right thing to do, and we'll just kind of deal with those, are all fine, but they need to be differentiated because they do allow the flexibility for us to have as a local authority, and indeed for landowners and bids, as you're saying, Alastair, in Fleet Street and things, for us to have that, to be able to curate space.
And I think that sense of location as well, in terms of what the ingredients of the cake are to make up a particular improvement district or a sector or a village of the city, they do require lots of different aspects to go into it. Nearly done. Transport, hot off the press as a result of various conversations going on between central government and the Mayor's office, and obviously Sadiq is chairman of Transport for London. Transport for us in terms of the city is key, isn't it? Bringing people into the city, Crossrail, Thameslink, absolutely fantastic. I think the centre of London is great on that spine. Do you see a situation where the city might have to step in and deliver some of those capital projects if TfL can't?
I mean, I think I was trying to find this out the other day in terms of we're obviously concerned about the reopening, or we are pressing for the reopening of the Waterloo and City line ASAP. That I think is not acceptable. That's the only line in London not to be open. It's just not acceptable. So that needs to be opened as part of the kind of deal that we have to allow the city to breathe. I think on that, and this could be urban myth, probably others will know, I think on that the city did have some engagement and sponsorship of that. But of course on Crossrail, although it's a drop in the ocean in terms of what it costs, we did actually contribute £200 million to the construction of the Elizabeth line, which is, as a percentage, is small, but as a contribution from the local authorities, I'd say a fairly large sum. We're never going to be in a position where we are funding capital projects, I think, that TfL GLA can't, simply because we've got custodianship of a load of things, which I alluded to at the beginning of this, where, we are under financial pressure ourselves. So, and we have all these major capital projects, so which are all good. Our markets project in Barking and Dagenham will make a massive difference to that area, as well as London as a whole, and things that free up space in the city. So I think we are making an impact, but we're not probably in a position, or not really, we're not really in a position to be doing that. But we are supportive of what TfL does, and we work very, very closely with them and the neighbouring boroughs. So work on this active travel has been very closely aligned with TfL and with the neighbouring boroughs with whom we have a good relationship. I mean, it may surprise people to know, but there's a lot of talk that is had between local authorities, particularly on boundaries and things, to ensure that we do our best, I suppose.
A quick reference, just in relation to the use classes order here, a question that's come in. We were talking about this yesterday in our meeting with the Fleet Street Quarter representatives and your colleagues at City Corporation on the planning side. There has been a widening of the use classes order. It does give people the opportunity, if their lease so allows them to do it, to make various changes and uses that could prove to be quite problematic in certain areas where a particular use you might not want to see in there. I think what I heard yesterday was that your officers are relatively powerless to do anything about it. Because this is part of the reformed use classes order, which is due to go in. Is there anything more that you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think, look, you know, if you start classing what is development in terms of development control, you know, that's what the government have done here, then it just means that in terms of planning control, it just isn't relevant. So therefore we have no locus. But as I alluded to earlier, I think that, you know, the reality is first the market and those curating space and in terms of ownerships and alliances and bids and things like that will work out what's best for areas anyway. So powerless implies that we're concerned about it. I don't think we really are. I mean, it's there needs to be some flexibility in my view, but you know, the market will sort this out, and the custodianship of others will sort this out. I think it's not like, you know, I would be far more concerned if I was chairman of planning at in a suburban location or whatever, where the character function of an area could really change. Where I wouldn't want it necessarily to do so. So, you know, the city isn't really like that. I think the key thing is we'll look to protect our key shopping streets as far as we can and encourage that. So particularly places like Fleet Street, Cheapside and others, where there is that offering there, where I wouldn't want a kind of deadening of that, so to speak. But look, I mean, people are being ingenious about kind of offerings now, and, you know, the market's responding to how that ground and basement use, you know, space is used. And one thing I've noticed, by the way, doing this job over I don't know how many years, is that these are cyclical things. So, you know, sometimes offices and commercial uses support the food and beverage and retail, and other times it's the other way around. And it kind of like all kind of cycles kind of goes round like that. And it could be useful, thinking aloud, if planning policy perhaps recognise that sometimes, and maybe that's what the government's kind of alluding to here. But in a nutshell, not particularly concerned about this, and I think people will be sensible around it.
Great. Well, just before your voice totally gives up, just one final point to finish on. Hypothetically, I'm an investor, I'm a developer. I'm coming to London because I want to invest £1 or such amounts as necessary. The city's in the middle of a city plan for 2036, which will be adopted in 2022, hopefully. What sort of a welcome will I get from your officers and from your members by coming to the city? And how can you steer me in a very straight sort of way as to a post-City of London COVID situation?
Well, one thing, I think everyone's more accessible. That's a really big positive of COVID, that I hear anecdotally that, you know, certainly from a planning perspective, that, you know, our department has been open and it's really easy to have perhaps more candid conversations. I've called it, like, it's the MIPIM effect. You know, no one's drinking on these calls, and we're not, you know, in the south of France, but for some reason there is more candor and more maybe directness to the conversation. And, you know, that's what you'll get. I mean, you know, we will be straightforward at a member and officer level about, you know, what the deal is and what we'd like out of things, but we'll equally listen to what applicants want as well. It's a collaboration. It's a partnership. I think, you know, and as I said before, the proof is in the fact that my colleagues are busier than ever. The competition for the space has not abated. So, you know, it's we know we've got a good product. Equally, though, we are not arrogant, as said before, to think we know all the answers. And there are examples like Fleet Street and with City Cluster, where vision, has been Fleet Street, City Cluster, and others. Because there is some energy there, massive amount of energy there to go in a certain direction, and that's what we should harness as a local authority and encourage. So,
Well, you've made it very clear that the city
willing to speak to anyone.
I think you've made it very clear that the city is very much open for business, and on behalf of the Chartered Surveyors Livery Company and my colleagues at Fairbrother, for everybody that's been on this call this afternoon, we're immensely grateful for your time and your openness about the city going forward, and we look forward to keeping that dialogue going with you. Thank you very much to everybody who's joined us today. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar in due course. Thanks very much.
Thank you.